King Hoover, King Shorty, Prince Old Timer, Godfather, all of them. They came from the six. The six pointed star represents King David. King David is known as the King of all kings because he brought many different nations until our foes, and they was called branches of the disciple nation. And because King David had a lot to do with bringing them in and leaving them with the leadership they had or placing leadership amongst them, he was known to be the King of Kings.
The origin story of the Black disciples is truly captivating and inspiring. It's a testament to the resilience and strength of young preteen boys who united against civil rights injustices and criminal gangs in their era. In 1958, there was racial tension in the Hyde Park and Kenwood neighborhoods, where white youths bullied black youths. Black families had started moving into the area due to the lifting of restrictive racial covenants. In Englewood, Italian families and greasers resented the influx of black families, leading to more bullying. The creation of the Dan Ryan Expressway forced many black families out of their communities and into neighborhoods like Englewood, which was an affordable option for settlement. A group of 11 to 13-year-old boys from Kenwood, Hyde Park, and Englewood formed a club to fight against their bullies. They chose the name Devil's Disciple after finding inspiration in the Bible. The disciples were located in various areas, with their original section. The East Side Disciples group began at 43rd and spread to Hyde Park, with 53rd and Kimbark serving as their headquarters. Meanwhile, Englewood Disciples congregated at 63rd and Stewart. The Disciples Gang was founded in 1958 by a group of individuals that included Richard Champ Strong, David Barksdale, Mingo Shreed, Prince Old Timer, Kilroy, Leonard Longstreet, Nightwalker, Laverne, and others. In the early days, the group did not have a central leader and kept their activities out of the media. The gang set up its headquarters at the intersection of 53rd and Kimbark in Hyde Park, which became their primary base of operations. The Disciples Gang's early days were marked by conflicts with several other gangs in the area. One of their main rivals was the Sons of Italy, a white gang of greasers in Englewood. The Sons of Italy were known for their hostility towards the neighborhood's changing demographics and would often take out their frustrations on black youths. The Disciples also had conflicts with other black gangs in Englewood, such as the Egyptian Cobras, who had moved to the area from Fuller Park in 1958. In 1959, the Disciples made their first expansion move by moving into the western part of the Woodlawn community, which was previously mostly white. The gang took over about 2/3 of the neighborhood, with the remaining third controlled by the Egyptian Cobras, who became one of the Disciples' main arch-rivals. Along with the original Blackston Rangers gang, these groups engaged in violent conflicts in the Woodlawn area. In 1959, black families began to settle in the South Shore community, a neighborhood that had a history of anti-black and anti-Jewish sentiment dating back to the 19th century. The arrival of black families was met with hostility, particularly from white gangs. In response, the Devil's Disciples Gang migrated to the community to support the black community in their struggles against discrimination and violence. Over the years, South Shore became a permanent home for the Disciples, with high-ranking and senior members often preferring to reside in the neighborhood. Many members of the gang also invested in the community by buying houses and properties, making it a significant and valued area for the gang. In 1959, the Disciples Gang also settled in the Greater Grand Crossing and Washington Park neighborhoods, both of which were heavily affected by poverty and blight. The Disciples patrolled the streets, working to eliminate other groups and gangs, taking on a guardian role that would become a significant part of their identity in later years. In 1958 and 1961, the Devil's Disciples Gang became increasingly powerful in northern Englewood, taking advantage of the opportunities created by the influx of black families in the area. The gang's recruitment efforts were successful, and by 1961, they had become the most powerful gang in Englewood. surpassing the previously dominant Italian greaser gangs. The Italian greaser gangs were unable to compete with the growing power and influence of the Disciples, and they eventually left Englewood. In 1961, at the age of 14, David Barksdale took over the leadership of the Devil's Disciples, becoming the youngest gang leader in Chicago's history. He directly oversaw the Disciples' operations in Englewood, where the gang was the most powerful and influential. In 1961, the same year that David Barksdale took over the leadership of the Disciples, Richard Strong and his family moved into the Cabrini Green public housing projects, which were largely controlled by various small gangs and the Egyptian Cobras. Strong quickly gained a following and recruited several black youths into his own gang, the Black Deuces, which was affiliated with the Devil's Disciples. Through Strong's leadership, the Disciples became a significant presence in the Cabrini Green area, which lasted until the projects were eventually torn down. In 1964, the Devil's Disciples extended their influence further south of 79th Street into neighborhoods such as Auburn Gresham, Chatham, Calumet Heights, Burnside, and Roseland, with the latter becoming the center of their settlement. These communities were experiencing uneasy racial transitioning, and there was often violent conflict between white and black residents. The Disciples arrived to support the black community during these struggles. With their settlement in Roseland, the legacy of the Wild 100s, these neighborhoods would become major strongholds for the Disciples for decades to come, up to the present day. During the 1960s, the Disciples also expanded their influence into the south suburbs of Chicago, including Harvey, Dixmoor, Phoenix, Chicago Heights, Robbins, and Ford Heights. They did so to address racial conflicts that often turned violent in these areas and to support the black community. However, the Blackstone Rangers were also settling in these communities, leading to a fierce rivalry between the two gangs. Despite the challenges, the Disciples established a permanent presence in these suburbs that has continued up to the present day. The Devil's Disciples were the largest gang on the South Side by 1965 and before. Even after the Blackstone Rangers started, Rangers were not as large. The Rangers only appeared larger because they were more outspoken to media outlets. On the date of January 6, 1966, the Disciples began recruiting gangs more instead of just focusing on recruiting just individuals. He wanted these gangs to all call themselves Disciple while still maintaining their original name. An example was when the Gonzatos became Gonzato Disciples when they agreed to be part of the Disciples as an alliance. The coalition expanded Disciple boundaries beyond into the Bronzeville area. This put Disciples in the Ida B. Wells, Clarence Darrow projects, Wentworth Gardens, Stateway Gardens projects, and heavily on the streets of Grand Boulevard and Douglas communities. Older gangs from these communities flipped to Disciples or attached their gangs to the Disciple name. In the near South Side, the Disciples moved into the Harold Ickey projects. This spreading of this nation did not gain much notoriety due to Disciples keeping their activity low-key. Therefore, you don't read much about it in the history books. What you'll read all about is how the rival Black Keystone Nation spread all over the place after that nation was created in 1966 to have their own alliance.
Ever since that I come to know a new King David, it was about programs with him. He made the community care for one another. We kept the communities clean. You see, he made sure that the needed family had clothes to always send their children to church and back to school in. You know, he did a whole lot, you know, along with all the other organizations participating in looking out and caring for one another, you see.
In 1966, the Disciples became heavily active in the community, opening fundraisers, legitimate businesses, enforcing school policies to keep kids in school. Maybe some of that money went to illegal activities, but a great deal of it went into helping the community. David Barksdale used his power for some good, as can be seen. The Disciples were also tied to civil rights groups and fought against civil rights injustices. In that summer of 1966, disciples even tried a peace treaty with the Rangers. This didn't last, but at least there was a large attempt. In the year 1967, the Woodlawn organization was awarded over $927,000 to be handed out to the Blackstone Rangers and the Black Disciples to operate job training centers for neighborhood youths in Woodlawn. All disciples and rangers involved were paid a salary to be instructors of this program despite the lack of training. Disciples received about $360,000 of this money for the program. In these programs, there were both disciple and ranger instructors and students in these classrooms. Sometimes gang fights and shootings happened in the classes. Black P. Stones and disciples squashed their war in May of 1968, and it lasted for days until May 8. David Barksdale was out around 65th and Ellis in the Woodlawn area when detectives showed up to talk to him. Barksdale told the cops that the Ellis Rebel Stones, the only Stone group in West Woodlawn, was out to kill him. He did a test and led the cops to the end of an alley, and sure enough, the Stones opened fire and shot at David. The Stones were then arrested, but this also ended the peace treaty. The year 1968 war began between the Disciples and Supreme Gangster allied gangs, especially with the Supreme Gangsters. Larry Hoover became the target for assassination attempts. He was shot on 2 occasions. Then on September 4, 1968, a third attempt was made on him. On this day, Englewood was on high alert as disciples, gangsters, and Stones were packing guns and ready to shoot each other. At Parker High School, members of the Supreme Gangsters and disciples were especially ready to get into drama against each other. Barron disciple member James Highsmith and disciple co-founder Leonard Longstreet entered Parker High School even though they weren't students. The two spotted Larry Hoover standing outside of the principal's office, and Highsmith walked past him with a smile as Longstreet shouted out, "Burn him." Highsmith pulled out a .32 pistol and shot Larry Hoover and 2 others nearby. No one was killed, but Highsmith was convicted of the shooting and sentenced to 1 to 5 years.
King David was cool with Jeff Ford. King David was cool with Jeff Ford, Eugene Harris. We all of us, we cool with different organization leaders. Okay. You see, but we are what we are.
During that fall season of 1968, the guns were blazing all over the South Side as disciples, gangsters, and Stones were at each other's throats as bodies were dropping. This led to a temporary truce between the 3 organizations that didn't last long, but it was an attempt to curtail the several acts of violence on the South Side. One thing to understand is that the leadership and founders did not want any more violence and were actually friends. This was a friendship of original Black P. Stones, Devil's Disciples, and Supreme Gangsters. They had no control of factions that would act in self-interest and started violence, with factions of the rival groups starting the gang wars. The leaders and founders were not interested in war. During the same year of 1968, Jeff Fort and the Black P. Stones were raking in thousands of dollars in government grant money after projecting the public appearance as a community youth group in need of funding to help poverty. The money went to a lot of good and helped open legitimate businesses that helped young blacks, but on the other side of it, some of the money was used for illegal activities, and this caught the attention of the FBI that began investigations. The same groups that granted money to the Stones also gave money to the Disciples as well. The Disciples did not stick their necks out as much for the money and received the money as a default because the gang apologists and liberal groups wanted to give money to the rivals of the Stones too. When Stones were questioned about who their worst rival is, they pointed to the Disciples, and that prompted these groups to line the pockets of the Disciples as well. Many of times without disciples even asking for the money. Disciples used a lot of this money for good, just like the Stones, as they opened legit businesses and created programs to help black youths on the South Side, just like how the Vice Lords and Stones were doing. Just like Vice Lords and Stones, the Disciples fell under FBI investigation for mismanaging those funds for illegal activities such as buying drugs and guns. The disciples' involvement with mismanaging these funds was not much in the newspaper because of their lower-profile activities, and the disciples didn't trust the white man and the social case workers. They practically had no choice by 1968 to deal with them after the money was practically forced on them. By the year 1968, the Robert Taylor Homes public housing projects were ran by gangs like the Cobra Stones, Mickey Cobras. 14-year-old Black disciple Vanguard heavy hitter enforcer Michael Mickey Bull Johnson moved into the Robert Taylor Homes in 1966 and became one of the first disciples in these projects at the age of 12. Johnson led a conquest to take over a large piece of the buildings between 49th and State down to 53rd and State in the Grand Boulevard and Washington Park neighborhoods in 1968. His conquest against the Cobra Stones was a success, and Mickey Bull put the disciples in the Robert Taylor Homes for the first time in history. He then became the leader of all BD operations in those buildings. In June of 1969, Larry Hoover had enough of the Stones and conferenced with David Barksdale instead. Larry Hoover's alliance with Jeff Fort as allies for a few months had gone sour, and now Hoover met with David Barksdale. The two groups established an alliance that had a title known as the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. The Black Gangster Disciple Nation consisted of the Gangster Nation, which was the Supreme Gangsters and their gangster allies. These gangsters were to be led by Larry Hoover. The disciples were now known as Black Disciples, and this was the alliance of all the disciple gangs led by David Barksdale. Prince Old Timer was appointed the Prince of the Disciples, while Tennessee the Prince of the Gangsters. Again, this was still just an alliance, but it was a combined concept alliance unlike the one between the Stones and the Gangsters. All disciple gangs and gangster gangs were all Black gangster disciples.
The Lord Stones and disciples came together, and they came together to vote one way, to stand for their communities. You see, to create jobs.
In June of 1969, the Vice Lords, Black P. Stones, and the Disciple Nation formed a coalition called the Lord Stones and Disciples, or LSD. Their goal was to demand equal rights, better job opportunities, and an end to oppression and poverty in their neighborhoods. The coalition successfully reduced gang violence between these three organizations, even after the CVL Inc. disbanded in the fall of 1970. Throughout 1969, the LSD coalition marched on City Hall, universities, and other locations to bring attention to their cause. In January of 1970, they achieved a partial victory with the implementation of the Chicago Plan, an agreement to provide 3,000 jobs or training positions in the construction industry for minorities. However, a coalition spokesman claimed that the actual agreement called for 1,000 jobs in each of the four categories listed. Chicago Defender, January 13, 1970. Unfortunately, the Chicago Plan failed to produce the expected results, and by October of 1973, the LSD coalition disbanded. Since 1968, David Barksdale had been working with leaders of the Black P. Stones on several failed peace treaties. By June of 1970, another peace treaty was in effect, but it was weak and short-lived. On June 7, 1970, David Barksdale was shot in the side at a bar located at 848 West 16th Street in the Englewood neighborhood. The accidental shooters were members of the Black P. Stones. During the shooting, one of the Stones dropped a rifle, which went off and struck Barksdale. Larry Hoover, who was present at the scene, acted quickly to get Barksdale into his car and raced to St. Bernard's Hospital in Englewood. Hoover was credited with saving Barksdale's life after Barksdale suffered an M14 bullet wound in his side that passed into his kidneys, causing permanent damage.